Some of you may have already seen the news stories about the new Title IX legislation released by Betsy DeVos back in early May of 2020. The point of the legislation was to standardize procedures across schools and improve what they call due process, but more on that later. The response to these new guidelines was pretty inflammatory, so today we're going to be doing a deep dive into the new Title IX legislation. So what the heck is Title IX?
What the frick is it?
What is it?
Title IX refers to an amendment that protects people from sex discrimination in education and programs that receive funding from the federal government. It is essentially supposed to ensure that both men and women have an equal opportunity to succeed in school environments.
The specific verbiage is, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. These few sentences pretty much cover everything from sports equity to sex discrimination to sexual assault and harassment.
As it pertains to sexual assault, most schools have had the liberty of deciding what cases they will investigate, what types of resources they will offer to sexual assault survivors, and what their investigative process will look like.
As you can guess, this led to a big ol' mess.
As long as the school could argue their process maintained equity between the sexes, they could do pretty much whatever they wanted, so naturally, they did the bare minimum.
So, given that universities were doing very little for survivors, you'd think this push for change would have come from the survivors, right? But the push for change actually came from the accused.
Gasp.
Several cases popped up where those accused of sexual assault were actually suing their universities for taking action against them, claiming that the university denied them due process. That's a pretty hefty claim, so let's dissect that a little bit. Before this new guidance, most university processes didn't require any type of cross-examination between the parties. Many times, each person would submit their side of the story with any supporting evidence they had, and then the university would review it and make a ruling. In some cases, the students wouldn't be able to see any of the documents the other submitted, thus having no way to refute it. Accused students argued that without any cross-examinations, the university was removing their right to adequately defend themselves against false accusations. These cases were actually really successful, and courts began ruling that all schools within their jurisdiction would need to hold cross-examinations in sexual assault hearings. Without specific legislation governing these processes, schools again did the absolute minimum. Even big-name schools like the University of Michigan required what was coined direct cross-examinations, requiring the students to cross-examine each other. Neither student was allowed representation. However, there was a hearing officer that would preside over the meetings. This sparked a substantial response among activist groups who claimed direct cross-examination was just blatant victim intimidation. What survivor was going to make a report knowing they'd have to sit face-to-face with the person who assaulted them and hear them deny it? Several students even made reports about the hearing officers making jokes and minimizing their experience during cross-examinations. Clearly, these patchy, decentralized policies were not working. So the Department of Education decided to come up with new Title IX guidelines to standardize the process across universities.
So now we're going to be doing a deep dive into the new guidelines and try and detect some problems with it. Sexual harassment is defined using 3 categories within legislation: quid pro quo, unwelcomed conduct, and sexual assault. So what is quid pro quo? It's essentially when a person in power tries to coerce sexual acts out of subordinates in exchange for something they want. A somewhat classic example would be when a boss is requesting sex in exchange for a promotion. In the new guidelines, proof of even the slightest quid pro quo is enough to pursue a Title IX investigation. With this type of harassment, you don't need to prove a pattern of behavior or pervasiveness, unlike the next category: unwelcome conduct. This category is much more vague than the other two, which has invited some criticism. It covers what most people would think of as standard workplace sexual harassment and would include things like unwanted remarks, objectification, etc. In order to pursue an investigation based off of these claims, the conduct has to be so severe and pervasive that a reasonable person would believe it affects that person's ability to achieve equality within their environment. Most of the criticisms against this definition lie in the severity and pervasiveness clause. It seems to set the bar unnecessarily high for cases of sexual harassment. Many activists argue that this clause is a gaping loophole within legislation, allowing schools and companies to squash sexual harassment claims by proving they did not affect that person's equity within the environment. It also seems criminally vague. Like, what is severe or pervasive? And why isn't the mere existence of unwelcome conduct enough to prove a person is being sexually harassed? It seems to be creating a lot more questions than answers. That brings us to our third and final category, sexual assault. The guidelines actually use the definition from the Clery Act, which includes rape, unwanted sexual touching, incest, and statutory rape. It also includes domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So overall, these definitions seem to lower the bar and broaden recognition in cases of sexual assault, while raising the bar and narrowing recognitions for sexual harassment.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the jurisdiction. And I want to talk about this specifically because I've seen a lot of outdated information out there, and so we're just going to try to address that and give you guys the latest updated information on the final publication of these guidelines. So in one of the earlier iterations of the Title IX guidelines, they were only going to consider on-campus cases as within the school's jurisdiction. This was met with a ton of backlash, as that would leave club sports houses, fraternity houses, and school-sponsored trips out of the school's jurisdiction, which many students argue is where most assaults end up happening. Thankfully, this did not make it into the final publication. A school's jurisdiction is defined to be anywhere on campus or any place the school has enough influence over to make an investigation. This specifically includes properties of school-sanctioned clubs, fraternities, sororities, and school-sponsored trips. We have noticed in our research that some activist groups are still posting the outdated information that frat houses aren't considered to be within a school's jurisdiction, so just watch out for that on social media. The new ruling actually gives schools more control over mandatory reporters. So, backing up, what even is a mandatory reporter? They're essentially employees of the school that would be required to notify the Title IX office if they identified any kind of sexual assault or harassment in the workplace or amongst their students. This new ruling allows schools to decide if all of their staff will be mandatory reporters or if there will be specific safe spaces to talk about sexual assault without automatically triggering a report to the Title IX office. If used properly, this could actually be really good for survivors. In a quote-unquote Survivors Anonymous setting, people could gain access to resources and a community without feeling like they're being forced into making a report.
This is a fairly minor clause, but schools are also required under the new guidance to make the Title IX office easily accessible to students, employees, and parents. They're instructed to provide everyone with the office's contact information, as well as instructions on how and when to contact them. It also states that any person can report sexual discrimination, even those who are currently under investigation. When a report is filed, schools are required to respond to it in the following ways. 1. They must offer supportive measures to the person who claims to be the victim. 2. They must promptly contact the alleged victim to discuss their options. And 3. They must respect a victim's wishes on whether or not to pursue a formal complaint.
Alright, so let's start with the general guidelines of the investigation process. There's nothing incredibly shocking here. The investigation must be impartial, the respondent is treated as innocent until proven guilty, etc. Although something I would like to make known is that Title IX officers must be trained to apply the rape shield, which prevents any evidence about a rape victim's sexual history from being evaluated in the investigation. This is largely regarded as a good thing, since oftentimes a victim's sexual history was used to unfairly discredit them during criminal rape investigations. So here's where our video is going to start to get pretty dense. I'm going to do my best to translate all the legal jargon so that you can all get a sense of what this process looks like. First, the schools are required to investigate any formal complaint made to the Title IX office. Upon receiving a formal complaint, they must notify both parties of the allegations, and they need to provide updates during the investigation. The second is the school holds the primary responsibility for gathering evidence as well as proving guilt or innocence. However, the school can't restrict the ability of either party to gather evidence or discuss the case with others, essentially meaning the school can't put a gag order on either of the students. And lastly, each party must be given the opportunity to choose an advisor, including a lawyer. But it's important to note, during this initial investigative process, the schools are not required to provide an advisor to either student. They are merely given the option of having one. This could create some problems for lower income students who may not be able to afford a lawyer. After the evidence has been gathered, the university is required to send a copy to both parties and their advisors and give them at least 10 days to respond. Once a final decision is reached, the schools are required to notify both parties and their advisors with information about their decision and how to make an appeal. Now, we're going to dive into the most controversial parts of the guidelines, cross-examinations. All colleges are required to include a cross-examination within their investigative process. The cross-examinations must be conducted in person by the party's representative. In simple terms, the victim must be cross-examined by the perpetrator's representative, and the perpetrator will be cross-examined by the victim's representative. The parties are not permitted to cross-examine each other. If either party does not have a representative, the school must provide one in live hearings, but again, not in the initial investigative process. Even though the parties will not be questioning each other directly, they are still permitted to view the hearing in person or through a live video feed. Schools are also required to keep a recording of the hearing. So why has this been so controversial? Rape and sexual assault already have disturbingly low reporting rates. An estimated 1 in 3 women, 1 in 6 men, and close to 50% of transgender people experience either sexual harassment or sexual violence in their lifetime. However, only 35% of sexual assaults are actually reported. What's even more disturbing is that only 10% of college students who experience sexual assault on campus make a report. So in a crime that is already grossly underreported, college students are one of the least likely groups to report. It stands to reason that a process designed to increase protections for accused students would further decrease reporting rates among victims. When colleges open back up in the fall, we could start seeing a decrease in crime statistics for sexual assault. However, be wary of those numbers. Low sexual assault statistics almost never mean that the school is doing a good job of policing and preventing assault. When Michigan State was investigating Larry Nassar, the university got flooded with sexual assault reports. At the end of the year, they set the record for most sexual assaults reported. This seems like pretty concrete proof that when we make survivors feel seen and heard, they make reports, which is exactly what we want to happen. When more reports are made, we have more accurate data. This data can affect policy as well as the amount of funding sexual assault centers receive. That's why it's so important to create safe spaces for survivors to report. And as it stands, it doesn't seem like these new guidelines will be doing that.
As always, thank you so much for watching this video. If you want more content like this, go ahead and like and subscribe, and if you want to see something that maybe we weren't planning on doing originally, just leave it in the comments and we will try and fit it in.
See you next time!